Another day, another anti-Trump story starts to fall apart. Hey, everybody, I'm Steve Green with Bill Whittle and Scott Ott, and this is Right Angle, brought to you by the members of BillWhittle.com. Gentlemen, on Friday, huge bombshell story released by Atlantic senior editor Jeffrey Goldberg, claiming that Donald Trump, said some horrible things about dead veterans and canceled a trip to a military ceremony or a cemetery just to avoid being around all those awful people. Let me read you the lead of this. When President Donald Trump canceled a visit to the American Cemetery near Paris in 2018, he blamed rain for the last-minute decision, saying that, quote, the helicopter couldn't fly, end quote, and that the Secret Service wouldn't drive him there. Neither claim was true. Actually, it turns out both claims are true. The records indicate that the flight was indeed scrubbed because of weather, and the Secret Service can't just up and move a president like that. It simply isn't done. The logistics are too hard. Scott, the story was based on 4 anonymous sources that Jeffrey Goldberg decided to protect because he thought they feared recrimination or something along those lines, which I guess could possibly be a thing. But we now have, I think it's 17 people on the record saying that Trump said no such thing. We have the actual records of the scrubbed flight that indicate it was indeed scrubbed due to weather. John Bolton, no fan of Donald Trump, and I know you read his book, says the Atlantic story is simply false. And this part really got to me. FOIA documents have also definitely proved, this is according to Matt Margolis, that Trump's visit to the cemetery was canceled due to weather. When Goldberg was asked about evidence that the cancellation was due to inclement weather, he admitted that it was likely true. I'm sure all of those things are true, is what he told CNN on Sunday, just 2 days after he thought, as the senior editor of The Atlantic, things that he thought were true enough to go to press with on Friday. Scott, as a professionally trained journalist, does this look like a story that's fallen apart to you?
Well, I mean, The Atlantic got their eyeballs, so what really matters? You know?
Ouch.
Does it matter whether it was true or not? Does it matter whether they can verify or corroborate any of that? Because they got the traffic that they were looking for. They got everybody in the country talking about it for a few days. And nobody's going to remember them a couple weeks from now. So, you know, how many people are subscribers to any kind of service provided by The Atlantic? This is why I think decent journalists, especially these days, perhaps there was a day when the anonymous source was a useful tool in order to, for example, report on government corruption that could not otherwise be reported on because people were afraid to come forward. They would lose their jobs or in other ways be threatened or marginalized. I don't think anybody has enough trust in the mainstream media anymore to allow the use of anonymous sources. If you're using anonymous sources, it basically says that there's nobody willing to go on the record to say that something that should just be a plain fact that any man should be willing to state openly can't be stated openly. And I just don't think anybody should buy it. So I saw the headline. It was a big kerfuffle that this was in the news. But when I first started reading about the story and found out that the whole thing was anchored in 4 anonymous sources, I decided it wasn't worth my time to read the story because I'm just not interested in finding out what people I don't know have to say. Who are not willing to stand by their word. So, whether, and then the second element of it is this. It's still being reported. In fact, I was listening to CNN as I was working this morning, and they're still reporting it as if there are no holes whatsoever in the story. And the thrust of the left's coverage of this, the commentators and the mainstream media sources, is that the reason why this is true is because we can believe it. And because we can believe it, it must be true. And so it is kind of this circuitous argument, and they can go back and cite a couple of circumstances where Donald Trump said some really bad things or exercised poor judgment, particularly in his remarks about Senator John McCain that got a lot of attention. And they can say, well, because he did that 4 or 5 years ago, therefore, he could easily have done this. Therefore, even though the people aren't willing to stand up and take credit for the quotes that are being attributed to them, we can trust it just because we already wanted it to be so.
Scott, you made me think of something that I can't believe it took me 3 or 4 days now to come up with. We have seen time and time again over the last 3 or 4 years that the probably surest path to fame and fortune in this country, or at least to additional fame and fortune, is to be a Trump insider who leaves the administration and starts telling tales out of school. If you've got 4 sources with stuff this damaging on Trump, why aren't they on book tour already?
Fair enough. We're looking at you, Michael Cohen.
Yeah, we sure are. All right, Bill, over to you. The other one that got me, this was, I think, the first part of Goldberg's step down, was when he was confronted, and I believe this was on MSNBC. Well, maybe not confronted, but asked about his anonymous sources. He said, "I share the view that it's not good enough to run a story like this with anonymous sources." But then he went on, and see if you can make sense of this statement. "But, like other reporters, I'm always balancing out the moral ambiguities and complications of anonymous sourcing with the public's right to know." This strikes me as being a lot like the back down from the helicopter being scrubbed or not. If your anonymous sources were good enough to have a huge story on Friday, why aren't they still good enough on Sunday when you're on MSNBC? And here we are on Tuesday, and those sources are still good enough to remain anonymous. I would feel a lot more confident about the Atlantic and about Jeffrey Goldberg if they could pick a story and stick to it.
The reason he's walking it back is because he expected people to believe it. And when people started challenging it, and when, more importantly, when the story didn't stick, when it didn't go, then he realized, oh, I'm in some trouble now. Now, as it turns out, you say this whole thing was based on 4 anonymous sources. So when we did our backstage show, I heard about these 4 anonymous sources, and I went down to the 42nd floor of the Bill Whittle skyscraper and handed off this challenge to our crack research team of several thousand people that we have down there. They were able to source the 4 anonymous sources. I don't want to say their first and last names because I don't want to dox them. So just the last names because they're fairly common. Strzok, Comey, Brennan, and Steele, apparently. And so there you go. There's a lot in this. It's telling. One of them is, and I think probably the most important one is, I try to be on the right side, not just of the political parties and divides. I just want to be on the side of the truth. And I've been a supporter of Donald Trump despite his flaws, and I've been a conservative despite the flaws of many people in the conservative movement. One of the things that convinces me the most that I'm on the right side is the fact that the people who I'm opposing have to lie and invent evidence to prove things that they believe are true, but that are not true. And that they will go to any lengths to invent and create evidence out of thin air in order to provide the evidence that is not there in the real world, that buttresses their view of the world and basically tends to attack mine and the rest of the people that call themselves conservatives. When in the Tea Party days, they accused the Tea Party of racism. The problem was there were no racist signs or any other way to prove that the racism that they sure was there wasn't there. This was inconvenient for them. People with some sense of a soul might conclude that, well, since there's no racist signs, maybe they're not as racist as we think they are. But that's not what happened. They had to go out and make racist signs and then go and pretend to be members of the Tea Party, and then they could provide the evidence to prove that there was no evidence for, so they were right in the first place. It's the exact same thing here. They know that Donald Trump is an evil guy, and they've also probably had a pretty good look at the poll numbers, and they've decided that if we're going to stop him, we have to do anything. And so what can we do to really hurt Donald Trump? Well, those low sloping forehead, knuckle dragging savages out in flyover country apparently still worship their military for some reason. We all know they're just baby killers who are out there to gain more oil for profit. But apparently he has some support among them. So why don't we go after his support for the military? That'll hurt him. And the thing I think is the most remarkable thing about this whole story, Steve, is that they seem to think that even if it were true, it would somehow convince the American people that Donald Trump hates America, hates the military, hates the common soldier, and so on. We've seen for 4 years how Donald Trump will salute the Marine Guards by the helicopter, pick up their hats when they get blown over, covered them with umbrellas. We've seen him gone down lines of policemen, shaking hands, talking to every one of them. We've seen him with the troops. He's had some colorful things to say about high-level generals, but he said them because they were political statements that were made, and he just replied to them in his fashion. But the idea that the Atlantic thinks that one article, even if it were true, I'm not going, I don't feel like going, therefore Trump hates America, is the kind of argument that you would make if you did nothing but live in the same circle of people that believed this same story, that he's an evil guy, that he's just nothing but nefarious, and we've got to find something about him that'll stick. So just file the story with the Russian collusion story. You can file it with the Ukrainian collusion story. You can file it with impeachment. You can file it with his mishandling of the COVID-19 thing. You can file it with the rest of them. All it does is to further destroy what shreds of credibility they had left, and to further convince not just Trump supporters, but more and more middle-of-the-road people every day that there's a terrible sickness in this country, and it's not Orange Man. It's the fact that the people who we have paid to be trustworthy have no standards, no credibility, no ethics, nothing. They're just political hacks. The mainstream media is the audio-visual department of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, the infotainment industry, as I've been referring to for the last couple of years. Folks, at first I was willing to give this story some credence, because when Donald Trump is pissed off, when somebody has gotten under his skin, he lashes out, and he can be pretty vicious about it. I think we all know that. It's one of my least favorite things about a guy I've really come to respect over the last few years, and that respect has been a real pleasant surprise in some ways, and not such a surprise in some other ways. Leaving all that aside, there's a logical fallacy in here that is exposed by the helicopter actually being grounded. Trump supposedly said these awful things, which seem out of character because we know what he actually thinks of wounded warriors. We've seen how he treats them, as Bill has pointed out already. But the logical fallacy is this. Trump supposedly said these awful things because he didn't want to go visit this cemetery. Well, the helicopter was actually grounded. He didn't have to get out of going to anything. There was no reason for him to say these awful things to getting out of a thing that he didn't need to get out of because the helicopter was grounded by bad weather. It's that simple fact, proven by actual evidence, blows Goldberg's story apart. There's no reason for any of it other than to make stuff up for political advantage. And maybe it worked. I don't know. I guess we'll find out on election day. That said, I do pick on Trump sometimes for when he lashes out thoughtlessly like this. But when he's good, he's really very good. Don't think of the guy that 4 anonymous sources claimed said these particular horrible things. Think back to his acceptance speech of the Republican National Convention a couple of weeks ago. I've been watching these things since 1980. I was a very weird 11-year-old kid, very involved in a presidential election. I've been watching these acceptance speeches since 1980. It's 11 of them now times 2, so I've probably seen 22 of these things, however the math works out. That's a lot of them. Trump's speech 2 weeks ago is one of the best, most stirring, most uplifting, and dedicated, patriotic, pro-America speeches I've ever seen. The man who said those words from an hour from his heart 2 weeks ago did not say those nasty things in 2018. That's your right angle on that. Hey, thanks so much for watching. I'm Steve Green with Bill Whittle and Scott Ott. I just want to remind you before we go that content like this needs sponsors like you, so please click on over to BillWhittle.com and click that join button. We need you on board, and we'd love to have you on board. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.